The tale of Kim Tae-chon begins not in the gilded halls of power he would later infiltrate, but in the harsh, gritty reality of post-war South Korea, a nation undergoing a tumultuous and often painful metamorphosis from a war-ravaged agrarian society into the economic powerhouse we know today. Born in 1953, in the immediate, fragile aftermath of the Korean War, Kim entered a world defined by scarcity, dislocation, and a profound struggle for survival. The chaos of the conflict had shattered traditional social structures, created a landscape ripe for new, often illicit, forms of order and enterprise. Busan, the city that would become his kingdom, was a particular crucible of this transformation. As a vital port and a haven for refugees during the war, it developed a unique character, hard-edged, entrepreneurial, and fiercely independent, yet also layered with deep networks of kinship and regional loyalty known as Dangpo. It was within this volatile ecosystem that a young Kim Tae-chon came of age, his formative years coinciding with the authoritarian rule of President Park Chung-hee, whose relentless drive for industrial development while catapulting the nation forward also created vast opportunities for corruption and underground economies. The so-called miracle on the Han River had its shadow counterpart in the back alleys of Busan and Seoul, where quick money could be made through smuggling, black market dealing, and securing lucrative contracts through any means necessary. Kim was not an educated aristocrat or a scion of a wealthy family. He was a product of the streets, a keen observer of human weakness and systemic gaps. He understood early on that in a society moving at breakneck speed, where the rules were being rewritten daily, true power lay in controlling the spaces the official system ignored or could not efficiently govern. His initial forays into the criminal world were likely humble, perhaps as an enforcer or a low-level operator in one of the many local factions, but even then, his distinguishing trait was not mere brutality, though he possessed that in abundance but a strategic mind that viewed violence as a precise tool, not an outburst of emotion. He saw the burgeoning construction industry, fueled by government contracts and the breakneck urbanization of Busan, as the perfect vehicle for his ambition. Here was a sector awash with money, requiring muscle to control labor, secure sites and intimidate competitors, and simultaneously demanding political connections to win bids and navigate regulation. Kim Tae-chon positioned himself as the indispensable link between these two worlds, the brutal, physical reality of the construction site and the opaque, paper-pushing reality of the city government. He built his initial power base by offering a one-stop solution for developers. His men would guarantee labor peace, manage community relations, a euphemism for silencing dissent, and, crucially, his growing web of contacts within the Busan Metropolitan Police and the local political machinery would ensure that bureaucratic hurdles mysteriously vanished. This was the genesis of the Busan Alliance, a term that would later send shivers down the spines of prosecutors, an intricate, symbiotic network where criminal power, political protection, and business interests became indistinguishable. Kim's genius was in institutionalizing corruption, making it a predictable, almost routine cost of doing business in his domain. He cultivated a reputation not as a wild-eyed killer, but as a ruthless businessman who kept his word to those who cooperated and unleashed unimaginable terror upon those who defied him. His organization operated with the cold efficiency of a corporation, with division overseeing construction, entertainment, nightlife, and loan sharking, all feeding into a central treasury that funded both lavish lifestyle and the continuous bribery that greased the wheels of his empire. By the late 1980s, early 1990s, as South Korea democratized, Kim Tae-chon had already entrenched himself so deeply that he seemed untouchable, a permanent fixture in Busan's landscape, his influence woven into the very concrete and steel of the rising city. The police were not his pursuers, they were often his employees, receiving regular salaries for their willful blindness. Politicians sought his support during elections, benefiting from his ability to mobilize votes and, more importantly, to suppress opposition in key districts. He lived extravagantly, but not ostentatiously in the manner of a flashy drug lord. His power was displayed in the deferential nods of high-ranking officials, in the seamless approval of multi-billion-won projects, in the quiet understanding that certain areas of Busan were, for all practical purposes, his sovereign territory, The public knew his name, heard the whispers of his deeds, but for the average citizen he was spectral force, a bogeyman used to scare children, a reality too dangerous to acknowledge openly. This was the pinnacle of Kim Tae-chon's world, a realm built on a foundation of fear, mutual benefit, and the calculated erosion of the line between state and criminal enterprise. He was, by every measure, the emperor of his own carefully constructed domain, ruling from shadowed boardrooms and exclusive clubs. His commands carried out with a quiet efficiency that made the violence underpinning it all the more terrifying in its restraint. The operational genius of Kim Tae-chon's empire lay in its seamless integration into the daily fabric of Busan economic life, making it not an external parasite but a malignant growth within the host organism itself. His primary engine, and the source of his immense wealth and political leverage, was the construction industry. In the booming landscape of 1980s and 1990s Busan, with its desperate need for new infrastructure, apartment complexes, and commercial buildings, public works contracts were the holy grail. Kim's organization, often fronted by legitimate-seeming companies like the now infamous Dongguan Development, perfected a system of bid rigging known as Yongtae or Dragon Tactics. The process was a masterpiece of criminal coordination. Before any major public tender was announced, Kim's network of insiders, often officials within the Busan metropolitan government's construction and planning departments, would leak the detailed project specifications, budget, and evaluation criteria to him. With this insider knowledge, Kim's men would then approach the other qualified construction firms. The offer was simple, brutal, and non-negotiable. Withdraw your bid or submit a deliberately non-competitive, higher-priced proposal. In return, you would receive a generous subcontract or a cash payment for your cooperation. Refusal meant immediate and severe consequences. The recalcitrant company would find its construction sites invaded by scores of threatening gangsters, halting work. Its executives would receive terrifying, graphic threats delivered to their homes. Its supply chains would mysteriously dry up, as truckers and material suppliers were intimidated into breaking contracts. More insidiously, the company would face sudden, relentless scrutiny from tax authorities, safety inspectors, and labor regulators, all activated by Kim's contacts within the bureaucracy. Faced with this multi-pronged assault, almost all competitors capitulated. Dongguan Development, or another Kim-affiliated company, would then win the bid at a price only marginally below the inflated ceiling, guaranteeing astronomical profits. This system was more than extortion. It was a shadow administration that redistributed public funds into the coffers of the crime syndicate with robotic efficiency. The profits were then cycled through a complex web of shell companies invested in legitimate business like hotels, restaurants, and the burgeoning entertainment districts in Busan's bustling Seomyeon area, and used to fund the second pillar of his power, systemic bribery. Kim institutionalized graft to a military degree. High-ranking police officers, prosecutors, and city officials were not bribed ad hoc for specific favors. They were put on regular monthly retainers, euphemistically called jianbi, or construction expenses. These payments were recorded in meticulous, secret ledgers that would later become the Rosetta Stone for investigators, coded with aliases but detailing amounts, dates, and positions with chilling clarity. This turned law enforcement and public administration not into adversaries, but into paid security for his regime. A police chief would not merely ignore Kim's activities, he would actively steer investigations away, tip him off about impending raids, and even deploy officers to protect Kim's interests during turf disputes. The third pillar was his control over the city's nightlife and informal finance. His gang, a disciplined army, often referred to as the Busan faction, levied protection money from every nightclub, bar, and karaoke room of significance. They also ran vast, loan-sharking operations, preying on small business owners in desperate straits, with exorbitant interest rates enforced by the threat of extreme violence. What set Kim apart was his enforcement philosophy. Public, messy violence was bad for business. It attracted unwanted media attention and could force even compromised officials to act. Therefore, violence was surgical, exemplary, and almost always delegated. When a businessman who had refused to play ball was found beaten to a permanent disability or a talkative underling disappeared, The message was sent without a word being publicly traced back to the emperor. His personal demeanor reinforced this image of controlled power, in contrast to the flamboyant, tattooed gangsters of popular imagination. Kim cultivated an image of a sober, sophisticated businessman. He was often seen in well-tailored suits, frequented high-end golf courses, a key venue for networking with elites, and spoke in measured, low tones. This veneer of legitimacy was his ultimate weapon, allowing him to move in circles where a traditional gangster would be instantly rejected. He became a silent partner in politics, bankrolling campaigns for mayors and national assemblymen from the Busan region, ensuring his influence reached into the very heart of the National Assembly in Seoul. For years, this system operated with near-perfect impunity. The public, the media, and even parts of the judiciary were gripped by a paralyzing omerta, a silent understanding that speaking against Kim Tae-chon was a death sentence, either physical or professional. He was not a man, he was a natural force, a fact of life in Busan, as immutable as the tides in its port. Yet, within this fortress of corruption, the first hairline fractures began to appear not from a heroic external assault, but from the inherent greed and internal pressures of the empire itself. As the profits grew astronomically, so did the ambitions and rivalries within his own syndicate. Younger lieutenants, hungry for their own piece of the pie, began to overreach, engaging in flashier, less disciplined crimes. The sheer scale of the bribery network made it vulnerable. The flow of money created a paper trail, however well hidden, and the number of people involved increased the risk of betrayal. Furthermore, the very political landscape that had sheltered him began to shift. The 1997 Asian financial crisis shook South Korea to its core, leading to a national soul-searching about the corrupt crony capitalism that had contributed to the collapse. Public tolerance for the collusion between business, politics, and crime plummeted. A new generation of prosecutors, less entangled in the old regional networks and emboldened by public sentiment, began to look south towards Busan with a determined, unforgiving gaze. The emperor, it seemed, might finally have to face a challenger he could not bribe or intimidate. The slow, grinding wheels of a changed national justice, the first chill wind that signaled the coming storm for Kim Tae-chon, did not blow from the street of Busan, but from the austere offices of the Supreme Public Prosecutor's Office in Seoul. In the late 1990s, a new breed of prosecutor was emerging, forged in the fire of the national IMF crisis, and armed with a public mandate to cleanse the nation of the corrupt jigs, the deep-seated ties between political power, business conglomerates, and organized crime that were blamed for the economic collapse. Among these men was a figure who would become Kim Tae-chon's most persistent and formidable nemesis, Prosecutor Lee In-kiwa. Lee was not a flashy personality, but he possessed a dogged, almost ascetic dedication to the rule of law and a profound understanding of financial crime. He represented a systemic threat. Kim had never fully faced an adversary whose currency was not money or fear, but evidence, and whose power base was a shifting national mood demanding accountability. Lee's initial focus was not Kim directly, but the rotten edifice of Busan's public procurement system. The first cracks appeared through a seemingly minor case, the suspicious smooth award of a contract for a new municipal waste processing facility. A disgruntled mid-level official, burdened by a sudden pang of conscience, or perhaps fearing he would be the scapegoat, provided an anonymous tip that the bidding had been a sham. This tip was the loose thread Lee and his small, trusted team began to pull. Their investigation was conducted with unprecedented secrecy, operating out of a makeshift war room in Seoul, deliberately bypassing the Busan District Prosecutor's Office, which was widely believed to be compromised. They used novel for the time forensic accounting techniques, tracing bank transfer and corporate registrations with painstaking care, moving from shell company to shell company, each one a Russian doll hiding a smaller, more secretive entity within. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. A significant percentage of Busan's major infrastructure projects over the past decade, from seawalls and bridges to public housing complexes, all followed an identical crooked path. culminating in profits that flowed into a constellation of companies that, after enough layers were peeled back, pointed to a single, shadowy nexus. The name Kim Tae-chon began to appear not in witness statements, for no one would yet dare speak it, but in the cold, hard logic of financial flows and corporate board memberships held by his relatives and frontmen. Lee in KYU understood that to charge Kim with simple extortion or assault would be futile. He would be insulated by layers of underlings and protected by his police allies. The only way to topple the emperor was to dismantle his economy, to follow the money to its source and prove the vast, institutionalized corruption that was his true crime. This financial trail, however, soon led to a more sensitive destination, the political establishment. Lee's team discovered repeated, large-scale financial transfers from Kim-linked companies into the campaign account of several prominent politicians from the Busan region, including a powerful sitting member of the National Assembly. This was the dangerous frontier of the investigation. Charging gangsters was one thing, implicating a National Assemblyman who enjoyed legislative immunity and powerful backers in Seoul was an act of professional and personal peril. The political pressure on Lee began almost immediately. He received veiled warnings from superiors about stability and the bigger picture. His investigation faced sudden budget shortages and bureaucratic delays. Whispers about his overambition and disregard for regional harmony were planted in the press. Meanwhile, in Busan, Kim Tae-chon's intelligence network, fed by his contacts within the very law enforcement bodies meant to investigate him, alerted him to the probe brewing in Seoul. His response was a masterclass in multi-layered defense. First, he ordered a temporary slowdown in the most blatant bid-rigging activities, creating a facade of legitimacy. Second, he initiated a counter-surveillance operation, having his men track the movement and contacts of Lee's investigators whenever they dared to enter Busan. Third, and most crucially, he activated his political shield. The implicated politicians, now fearing for their own careers, began to loudly denounce the prosecution's investigation as a political, motivated witch hunt by the central government against the proud people of Busan, framing it as an attack on regional identity itself. This narrative found fertile ground, allowing Kim to temporarily reposition himself from a criminal parasite to a misunderstood native son being persecuted by out-of-touch Seoul elites. Fourth, he prepared his financial firewalls. Key ledgers were digitized, encrypted, and moved to offshore locations. Shell companies were dissolved, and new ones created in a complex game of three-card monte with corporate registries. The goal was not to defeat Lee and KYU in court, but to make his task so legally complex, so politically toxic, and so dangerous that he would be forced to abandon it or settle for a few low-level convictions. For the first time in decades, Kim Tae-chon was in a defensive posture, but he was defending a fortress of immense strength. He watched from his penthouse as the first skirmishes played out in the media and political backrooms, confident that the system he had corrupted would ultimately protect him. He underestimated, however, the quiet tenacity of Lee in KYU and a new factor that would soon enter the equation, a technological revolution that would make the old ways of secret record-keeping obsolete, and a single catastrophic lapse in discipline from within his own innermost circle that would provide the key to the entire kingdom. The fortress of Kim Tae-chon, impervious to external siege for nearly 2 decades, developed its fatal flaw, not from a battering ram, but from a whispered secret within its own innermost chamber. The meticulous ledgers that were the empire's operational blueprint, recording every bribe paid, every politician on the payroll, every police official receiving a monthly salary, were its greatest vulnerability. For years, they existed as physical handwritten notebooks, guarded with a protocol rivaling that of a state secret. Only Kim's most trusted chief accountant, a man known as Accountant Park, and perhaps 1 or 2 others, had full access. However, as the business grew and the network expanded into the digital age of the late 1990s, the volume of transactions became unmanageable for paper records. Under Kim's orders, the critical data was transferred to a computer database. This move, intended for efficiency, created a digital ghost that could be copied. The man tasked with this digital archiving was a mid-level operative named Jang Myung-soo, a tech-savvy but deeply dissatisfied member of the organization. Jang was not a street enforcer. He was a numbers man who understood the full, grotesque scale of the corruption, he also felt chronically underappreciated and underpaid, watching as intelligent but more brutish lieutenants lived in greater luxury. More critically, he was privately terrified. Prosecutor Lee in KYU's investigation, though shrouded in secrecy, sent tremors through the organization. Jang, with his access to the financial heart, knew exactly how devastating those ledgers would be if discovered. He began to calculate his odds of survival in a sinking ship. The paranoia Kim cultivated to control others now turned against him. Jang reasoned that when the collapse came and he began to believe it was inevitable that boss would sacrifice the foot soldiers and the accountants to save himself and the politicians, Jang decided to secure an insurance policy. Over several months, using his privileged access during late-night sessions, he meticulously copied the entire digital ledger onto a series of floppy disks. This was not just a list of numbers. It was a comprehensive directory of corruption. It contained coded entries like Senior Superintendent A, Southern Busan Precinct Monthly, 5 million won, or Assemblyman B as Secretary Election Support, 200 million won, and detailed logs of bid rigging on projects like the Busan Newport A, the Gwangan Bridge expansion, with profit distributions to various shell companies. The data was encrypted, but Jang had the passwords. He hid the disks in a safety deposit box under a false name, ticking time bomb at the heart of the empire. The detonator was pulled in early 2000, following a relatively minor internal dispute over the distribution of profits from a nightclub protection racket. Jang was summoned for a disciplinary review. Fearing this was a prelude to his elimination, a common fate for those perceived as disloyal or knowledgeable, he panicked. Instead of attending the meeting, he vanished. He did not go to the police immediately. He knew the local police were Kim's men. Instead, through a tortuous route involving a friend, he sent an anonymous message to Prosecutor Lee and KYU's team in Seoul, offering the key to Busan in exchange for witness protection, a guaranteed reduced sentence for his own inevitable prosecution. Lee, recognizing this as the potential breakthrough, moved with audacious speed and secrecy in a scene that would not be out of place in a spy thriller. A clandestine meeting was arranged in a neutral city, not in Busan or Seoul. Jang, terrified and looking over his shoulder, handed over the disks. The prosecutors, with the help of national forensic computer experts, decrypted the files. What they saw on their monitors left even the hardened investigators stunned. It was not mere evidence. It was the complete anatomy of a criminal state. The ledger listed over 130 recipients of regular bribes, including the names, ranks, and specific amounts paid to nearly 50 active police officers, from beat cops to senior superintendents. It detailed payments to officials in the Busan City Hall's construction, tax, and land management bureaus. Most explosively, it contained clear financial trails to aides of several national assemblymen and direct payments to a high-profile businessman politician who was a close associate of the then president. This was no longer just a case about a gangster. It was a direct map to the core of regional and potentially national power. Lee in KYU now faced the moment of supreme crisis and opportunity. To act on the ledger meant declaring war on the entire power structure of South Korea's second city and its representatives in the capital. The political backlash would be immediate and ferocious. There would be immense pressure to bury the evidence, to prosecute only Kim and a few gangsters while leaving the respectable names untouched. Lee understood that to do so would be to validate Kim Tae-chon's entire life's work, the systemic corruption of institution. With the quiet support of a few key, reform-minded superiors in Seoul, Lee made the fateful decision they would follow the evidence wherever it led. The investigation, codenamed Operation Clean Sweep, was launched with military precision. To avoid leaks, hundreds of prosecutors and specially vetted police officers from outside the Busan region were mobilized in a single night. Warrants were secured in secret from judges in Seoul. As dawn broke on a spring morning in 2000, simultaneous raids hit over 80 locations across Busan and beyond. Kim Tae-chon's offices, his lavish home, the headquarters of Dongguan Development, the private offices of the implicated politicians, and the police precincts whose commanders were listed in the ledger. The most critical raid was on Kim's own main office. He was caught completely off guard, arrested while still in his pajamas, a look of utter incredulity on his face, not at being arrested, but at the sheer scale and confidence of the operation. The emperor had been taken not in a battle, but in a pre-dawn ambush executed by an enemy who had finally obtained the plans to his castle. The seizure of the physical counterpart to Jang's digital files during these raids provided the corroborating evidence needed. The era of Kim Tae-chon's untouchability ended not with a defiant last stand, but with the silent, blinking cursor on a computer screen that had betrayed all his secrets. The morning of the raids sent seismic tremors through every layer of South Korean society. A national shock that resonated from the bustling fish markets of Busan to the hushed corridors of the National Assembly in Seoul. The news, when it broke, was not a drip feed of scandal but a cataclysmic deluge. Front pages were dominated by images of Kim Tae-chon, no longer the untouchable emperor in a fine suit, but a disheveled man in handcuffs, his face a mask of stunned defiance, being escorted by stone-faced prosecutor from a regional office he had once considered under his influence. But the true bombshell was the list, the meticulously documented roster of accomplices that read like a who's who of Busan's establishment. As the prosecution service, led by Lee in KYU, began to formally release details, the public, its initial disbelief curdled into a potent mixture of outrage and grim validation. Here was proof, in cold, hard-won ledger entries, of what many had suspected but could never articulate, that the gangster on the street was merely the visible symptom of a disease that had infected the police, the city government, and the political elite. The Busan Police Agency was thrown into immediate and profound disgrace. Officers whose names appeared in the ledger were suspended, then arrested in humiliating public spectacles, their uniforms stripped of insignia. The public's trust in law enforcement in the region evaporated overnight. Citizens wondered aloud how many crimes had been ignored, how many victims had been silenced because the investigating officer was on Kim's payroll. The city hall became a scene of chaos and panic. Mid-level bureaucrats and senior administrators were led out of their offices, covering their faces with jackets or documents. As flashbulbs popped, the economic fallout was instantaneous. Major construction projects funded by public money, now exposed as frauds, ground to a halt. Banks froze the accounts of implicated companies, causing a ripple effect of panic in the local economy. The very foundations of Busan's rapid development were now questioned. Was it a modern metropolis or a criminal enterprise built with public funds? The most intense firestorm, however, engulfed the political sphere. The implicated National Assemblymen, figures of considerable power and seniority, initially responded with bombastic denial and counterattacks. They held press conferences, framed the prosecution's move as a politically motivated judicial coup, an attempt by the central government and the ruling party to crush regional opposition. They played on Busan's historic sense of autonomy and pride, trying to redirect public anger towards Seoul. For a brief, tense period, it seemed the old defenses might hold, that the powerful could still weave a narrative of persecution and escape accountability. But prosecutor Lee in KYU and his team had anticipated this. They began a controlled, relentless release of evidence to the media, not full ledgers, but specific, undeniable entries. When an assemblyman denied ever receiving money, the prosecution would present a bank record showing a transfer from a Kim-controlled shell company to the assemblyman's campaign manager on a specific date, matching an entry in the ledger. The political bluster began to crack under the weight of forensic detail. Public pressure became unbearable. Newspapers ran daily countdowns and charts tracking the corruption web. Civic groups, empowered and furious, held massive rallies in Busan and Seoul, demanding a full cleansing. The scandal, dubbed the Busan Gate by the media, became the sole focus of national discourse. In this superheated atmosphere, the first major political domino fell. A senior assemblyman from Busan, a man with decades of political clout, tearfully announced his resignation from his party and from the National Assembly, citing a desire to take responsibility and relieve the burden on the people. It was not an admission of guilt, but it was a monumental capitulation. His fall created a cascade. One by one, other implicated figures saw their political immunity stripped away by their own parties, who, were now in a desperate scramble for survival, eager to distance themselves from the toxic scandal. The ruling party itself was not immune. The tentacles of Kim's network reached into its ranks as well, leading to a painful internal purge. The judicial process began to move with a speed unusual for South Korea. Kim Tae-chon and his top lieutenants were indicted on a breathtaking array of charges: operate a criminal syndicate, habitual extortion, fraud, bribery, tax evasion, and attempted murder. The trials were held not in Busan, where finding an impartial jury and judge was deemed impossible, but in the more neutral city of Daegu. The courtrooms were packed with journalists, citizens, and a heavy police presence. Kim, initially defiant, maintained a steely silence, instructing his lawyers to challenge every piece of evidence. His defense strategy was two-pronged. First, to claim the ledgers were fabrications, the work of a disgruntled underling. Second, to argue that any payments made were legitimate political donations or business consulting fees, not bribes. However, the testimony of accountant Jang Myung-soo, now in the witness protection program, was devastating. He explained the codes, the system, the meaning of each entry, with the calm detachment of a technician. His testimony corroborated by the mountain of seized financial records and the testimonies of lower-level gangsters who, seeing the empire crumble, began to cut deals. The trial revealed the mundane, bureaucratic horror of the operation: the monthly salary meeting, the coded text messages, the deliberate use of legitimate business structures to launder money. It painted a picture not of a romanticized underworld, but of a corrosive, greed-driven enterprise that had hollowed out a city's institution. As the trial progressed, Kim's demeanor shifted from defiance to a simmering, palpable rage. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated businessman was gone, revealing the ruthless gangster beneath. He would glare at witnesses, mutter threats under his breath, and once had to be restrained. After hurling a water pitcher at a former subordinate who was testifying against him, the emperor was being unmasked in the most public way possible, and the sight was not of a powerful king, but of a cornered, vicious animal lashing out at the bars of his cage. The public, watching this spectacle, felt a sense of cathartic justice, but also a deepening horror at the scale of the betrayal. The Busan Gate scandal was no longer just about one man's crimes. It was a national trauma, a stark revelation of how deep the roots of corruption could grow when fertilized by silence, fear, and complicity. The verdict in the trial of Kim Tae-chon was not merely a judicial conclusion. It was a historic reckoning, a moment where the gavel's sound echoed through the hollowed-out institutions of an entire city. After a marathon trial that laid bare the intricate mechanics of his empire, the judges of the Daegu District Court returned with a judgment of crushing finality. Kim was found guilty on all major counts: leading an organized crime syndicate, systematic bribery, habitual extortion, fraud on a colossal scale, and attempted murder. The sentence was designed to be a message, a symbolic life term that aimed to match the enormity of his crimes. Life imprisonment for his key lieutenants. Sentences ranged from 15 to 25 years. The court's statement read like a societal autopsy describing Kim's organization as a criminal enterprise that fundamentally undermined the rule of law, distorted the fair economic order, and destroyed public trust in state institutions in the Busan region. It explicitly stated that the severity of the sentence reflected not just the criminal acts themselves, but their corrosive effect on democracy and the basic social contract. The verdict was met with a stunned silence in the courtroom, followed by a wave of emotional relief from the victims and civic observers present. Kim himself, upon hearing the words, showed no visible reaction, his face settling into an expression of granite-like contempt, as if the judgment of the state was a trivial nuisance from a world he no longer acknowledged. His legal team immediately appealed, initiating a process that would wind through the higher courts for years, but the life sentence stood as a powerful psychological and legal barrier. The emperor was dethroned, and his crown was a prisoner's number. The fallout extended far beyond the defendant's dock. In a series of swift, subsequent trials, the accomplices named in the ledger faced their own days of judgment. Over 30 police officers, including 2 senior superintendents, were convicted and sentenced to prison terms, their careers and reputations in ruins. The Busan Metropolitan Police Agency underwent a painful, forced reorganization, with hundreds of officers transferred or forced into early retirement in an attempt to purge the corrupted culture. The scandal essentially decapitated the agency's leadership for a generation. In City Hall, a similar purge unfolded. High-ranking officials in the construction and planning bureaus were imprisoned, and a cloud of suspicion hung over the entire administrative apparatus for years. The political casualties were the most spectacular. Several National Assemblymen, unable to withstand the overwhelming evidence and public fury, were expelled from the National Assembly, while some avoided prison due to the complexities of proving direct bribery versus campaign finance violations. Their political lives were effectively ended. One prominent businessman politician, a close associate of Kim's, was sentenced to a significant prison term for bribery and fraud, a fall from grace that sent shockwaves through the corporate world. The Busan alliance was not just broken, it was publicly dismantled piece by corrupt piece. Its members paraded in a grim procession of perp walks that played on the evening news for months. The economic landscape of Busan underwent a violent correction. The Kim syndicate's vast portfolio of assets, from construction firms and nightclubs to real estate holdings and loan sharking operations, was seized by the state in one of the largest asset forfeitures in South Korean history. This created a power vacuum and a temporary economic freeze. Legitimate businesses that had been coerced into unfair contracts or partnerships suddenly found themselves free but also adrift, dealing with the aftermath of years of distorted market conditions. The construction sector in particular entered a period of painful transparency as the old, corrupt system of bid rigging was shattered, forcing companies to compete on actual merit and price. For the first time in a generation, this period of adjustment was fraught with instability, but it was the necessary painful medicine for a diseased economic body. For the ordinary citizens of Busan, the aftermath was a complex mixture of vindication, anger, and uncertainty. There was a palpable sense of a weight being lifted, of being able to speak openly about matters that were once deadly secrets. Shopkeepers and small business owners who had lived in fear of Kim's enforcers could now breathe easier. Yet, there was also a profound sense of betrayal and embarrassment. The city's reputation was tarnished nationally. It was now synonymous with epic corruption. This sparked a fierce, introspective civic debate about regional identity, asking how Busan's famed toughness and independence had been perverted into a shield for criminality. Citizen watchdog groups were formed, and local media, previously cowed, found a new voice and a mandate for aggressive investigative journalism. The scandal became a permanent case study in schools and universities, a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional capture. Prosecutor Lee in KYU became a national hero, a symbol of incorruptible justice, though he paid a personal price, facing years of threats and political isolation from the powerful enemies he had made. His success, however, emboldened a generation of younger prosecutors and journalists to take on other entrenched powers. The Kim Tae-chon case proved that no fortress of corruption, no matter how high its walls or deep its moats of complicity, was truly impregnable if the will to dismantle it, backed by undeniable evidence and public support, was relentless enough. The physical man, Kim Tae-chon, was now inmate number 745, beginning his life term in a high-security prison. But his specter continued to loom over Busan, a dark chapter that had finally been closed, its lessons etched into the city's consciousness with the permanence of a judicial decree. The transition from the Emperor of Busan to inmate number 745 in a high-security facility was a psychological earthquake of unimaginable magnitude for Kim Tae-chon, confined to a sterile, regimented world where his name commanded no special fear, only bureaucratic notation. He faced an enemy his wealth and violence could not touch: irrelevance. The initial years of his life sentence were a relentless battle against this new reality, fought on the battleground of his own pride and the cold mechanics of the judicial appeal process. His legal team, funded by what remained of his hidden assets and loyalists on the outside, mounted a series of aggressive appeals, arguing procedural errors, challenging the credibility of Jang Myung-soo as a witness, and claiming the ledgers were incomplete or misinterpreted. These appeals snaked their way through the High Court and ultimately to the Supreme Court of South Korea, consuming years. Yet, at every level, the core judgment held firm. The evidence was too voluminous, too internally consistent, and too deeply corroborated by financial records and other turning witnesses. The Supreme Court's final rejection of his appeal was a tombstone on his legal hopes. His life sentence was now immutable. The full weight of the state's judgment settled permanently upon his shoulders. Within the prison system, Kim was placed under a regimen of strict isolation and heightened surveillance. He was not housed with the general population, both for his own protection from inmates seeking notoriety and to prevent him from orchestrating operations from within. His communications were monitored, his visitors heavily restricted to immediate family and lawyers. The state was determined to ensure his empire could not be remotely controlled. This isolation was a form of torture for a man whose power had been entirely relational, built on networks, commands, and the constant assessment of loyalties. Now his world shrank to the dimensions of a cell, his interactions reduced to monosyllabic exchanges with guards. Reports from prison officials, though scarce, suggested a man oscillating between furious defiance and deep, sullen depression. He reportedly spent hours writing lengthy, rambling memoranda to his lawyers and to the court, re-arguing his case. A king trying to rule a kingdom that no longer existed on paper. He maintained a rigid, cold demeanor, refusing to participate in rehabilitation programs or show any remorse. His very posture a silent scream of contempt for the authority that had caged him. Yet, the empire he left behind did not simply vanish with his incarceration. It underwent a violent, chaotic metamorphosis. With the keystone removed, the arch of the Busan underworld collapsed into a fragmented, bloody scramble for power. The disciplined Busanpe shattered into rival factions led by his former lieutenants, each claiming legitimacy. These were not strategic successors but desperate claimants, and their battles were not the calculated, behind-the-scenes manipulations of Kim's era, but raw and overt wars for the remnants. Turf battles over nightclub districts, construction, site extortion, and loan-sharking territories erupted into public violence, street shootings, arson attacks on businesses, and brazen assassinations in crowded restaurants, the kind of messy, attention-drawing chaos Kim had always avoided. This violence was a sign of weakness, not strength, and it invited a fierce and uncompromising response from a now reformed and hyper-vigilant Busan police force, eager to prove its reformed character. Dozens of these mid-level gangsters were rounded up in successive crackdowns, their organizations dismantled before they could coalesce into a new monopoly. Furthermore, the nature of crime itself in Busan was changing. The golden goose of large-scale public works, bid rigging, was dead, its mechanisms exposed, and safeguards, however imperfect, installed. The political class, scorched by the scandal, became terrified of any association with organized crime, making the old symbiotic relationships nearly impossible to reforge. This forced the surviving criminal elements to diversify into new, less politically dependent areas: cybercrime, international fraud, and drug trafficking, which required different skills and international connections, fracturing the old, geographically bound power structure even further. Kim, from his cell, likely heard whispers of this disintegration, a torment worse than any physical deprivation. His life's work was not being inherited, it was being cannibalized and made obsolete. The outside world, meanwhile, moved on. Busan, after the initial trauma and economic disruption, began a slow, arduous process of institutional healing and reputational repair. New political figures, untainted by the scandal, emerged. The media and public maintained a sustained vigilance against corruption, making a return to the old ways infinitely riskier. Kim Tae-chon's name, once uttered in a whisper, began to fade from everyday conversation, transitioning from a present threat to a historical cautionary tale, a symbol of a corrupted past that the city was trying to overcome. In prison, his health began to show signs of decline. The stress, the bitterness, the sheer inertia of a life devoid of purpose took a physical toll. He was reported to suffer from hypertension and diabetes, chronic condition, managed by the prison clinic, but worsened by the psychological strain. The once imposing figure who had commanded rooms with his silence was becoming an aging, ailing man in a prison uniform. Yet, even in this diminished state, the core of his defiance remained. He never admitted guilt, never expressed remorse to the families of those he had ruined or the city he had poisoned. He lived in a prison of his own making long before he entered the physical one, a prison of absolute ego that could not comprehend accountability. His existence became a stark monument to a singular truth, that the ultimate downfall of a criminal who builds an empire on corrupting systems is not merely arrest, but the agonizing, slow-motion spectacle of witnessing that empire turn to dust. Knowing that your name will be recorded in history not as a mastermind, but as a corrosive failure, a man who mistook fear for respect, corruption for power, and discovered too late that the walls he built to protect his kingdom were the very walls of his own eternal cell. The end for Kim Tae-chon arrived not in a blaze of defiant glory or a final courtroom showdown, but with the sterile, quiet inevitability of a failing body in a state institution. On November 22, 2009, in the prison infirmary of the Daejeon Correctional Institution, the man who was once the Emperor of Busan succumbed to complications arising from liver cancer. He was 56 years old. His death was a bureaucratic event, a formal announcement from the correctional service, a brief, factual report on the evening news, a closing of a file. There was no dramatic deathbed confession, no last-minute revelation, only the silent, clinical conclusion to a life that had long since ceased to wield any power in the outside world. The cancer that claimed him had been diagnosed some time earlier. He had been undergoing treatment within the prison's medical facility. The news of his illness had barely caused a ripple in the public consciousness. He had already receded into the realm of history. Concluded chapter. His final months were spent in the grim, liminal space of a prison hospital ward, a world of bleached sheets, the smell of antiseptic, and the distant sounds of locked doors, a far cry from the opulent restaurants and private golf courses that had once been his domain. The once feared mobster was reduced to a patient among patients, dependent on the care of the state. He had spent a lifetime undermining. The psychological torment of those final days is impossible to fully comprehend. To be imprisoned is one form of hell. To face one's mortality within that prison, stripped of all agency, dignity, and legacy, is another. He reportedly received few visitors in his final decline. His family, having lived for years under the shadow of his infamy, maintained a fragile, distant contact. Former associates, those not in prison themselves, had long since scattered or were too fearful of association to visit. He died as he had lived his last decade in a profound and isolated silence. The official announcement of his death triggered a brief, muted wave of media retrospectives, summarizing his rise and fall in tidy, moralistic segments. The dominant public emotion was not mourning, but a final, quiet sigh of closure for the people of Busan. It was the definitive end of a dark era. The physical embodiment of their city's deepest shame and institutional failure was gone. There was no parade, no celebration, just a collective acknowledgement that a lingering ghost had finally been laid to rest. The criminal underworld he had dominated observed his passing with a similarly subdued, pragmatic silence. The factional leaders fighting over the ruins of his empire saw no benefit in publicly honoring him. He was a symbol of a failed model, a cautionary tale about overreach and the dangers of political entanglement in a new, more volatile age. His death provided no rallying point. Instead, it merely confirmed the absolute finality of his downfall. There were no large, public gang funerals, no procession of black sedan. Such displays would have been an immediate target for the police. His remains were quietly claimed by his family, and the funeral was a small, private affair, attended only by a handful of relatives, a stark and lonely contrast to the crowds of sycophants and powerful figures would have filled a cathedral in his prime. In a symbolic gesture rich with unspoken meaning, his family reportedly chose not to bury him in his hometown of Busan, the city whose soul he had both mirrored and corrupted. He was interred elsewhere, his final resting place kept discreet, as if to prevent his grave from becoming any kind of shrine or a focal point for lingering sentiment. This quiet burial was the ultimate testament to his obliterated legacy. Even in death, he was in exile. The legal and institutional aftermath of his life, however, continued to reverberate. The Busan Gate scandal had permanently altered South Korea's legal and political landscape. It had led to stricter laws on organized crime, more robust witness protection programs, and greater independence for prosecutors investigating corruption. It had proven that even the most entrenched regional power structures could be dismantled with sufficient political will and forensic evidence. Prosecutor Lee in KIU, the man who had spearheaded the case, saw his career become a blueprint for a new kind of anti-corruption crusader. Though he too faced the long-term personal costs of such a monumental fight, the police, political, and business establishments in Busan underwent a generational change with a heightened, if sometimes performative, sensitivity to ethical conduct. The city itself continued its journey, the shadow of Kim Tae-chon gradually fading under the relentless march of new developments, new scandals, and new ambitions. Yet, for those who had lived through it, his story remained a foundational trauma, a lesson in the price of silence and the perils of allowing any man to become bigger than the law. His death closed the biological book on Kim Tae-chon, but it did not erase the historical record. He remains etched in the annals of South Korean crime as a unique figure, not the most prolific killer, nor the richest smuggler, but perhaps the most successfully insidious. A man who understood that true power lies not in evading institutions, but in hijacking them. His end, lonely and subdued in a prison infirmary, served as the final, ironic sentence. The emperor had no clothes, no crown, and in the end, no kingdom, just a prison number, a medical chart, and a death certificate that marked the conclusion of a life that had confused terror with power, and in doing so, had lost everything that gives a human life meaning: respect freely given, legacy positively remembered, and a peace that comes not from the fear one instills in others, but from the integrity one builds within oneself. The story of Kim Tae-chon, from the streets of post-war Busan to an anonymous prison death, is ultimately a tragedy in the classical sense, a tale of fatal overreach, where the protagonist's greatest strength, his understanding of systemic corruption, became the very flaw that led to his utter and complete ruin, leaving behind not a legend but a warning. The story of Kim Tae-chon, in its chilling totality, transcends the biography of a single criminal to become a dark mirror held up to society itself, reflecting profound and uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, the architecture of corruption, and the fragile vessels of human legacy. His reign and ruin force us to interrogate the very soil in which such a figure can grow. He was not an anomaly that invaded a healthy system. He was a symptom of a system in transition, one where rapid economic growth, centralized political power, and regional identities created exploitable fissures. His genius, a malignant one, lay in recognizing that in the space between a dictatorial state's heavy hand and a fledgling democracy's tentative institutions, there existed a vacuum of real, localized power. He did not fight the state, he parasitized it, offering a shadow governance that provided brutal efficiency where bureaucracy was slow, decisive violence where the law was ambiguous, and a perverse form of stability through fear in a time of tumultuous change. This forces uncomfortable societal introspection. To what extent does a society, in its hunger for order and development, tacitly tolerate or even create its own Kim Tae-chons? When citizens see public works projects completed on time through gangster mobilized labor, when business owners pay a tax to a local syndicate for protection that seems more reliable than the police, when a neighborhood feels safer because a known mobster disapproves of petty crime that might draw outside attention, a sinister social contract is written. Kim's empire was built on this contract, a testament to the fact that corruption is rarely a simple theft, but often a twisted exchange providing services, security, or economic activity where the formal state is absent, inefficient, or itself corrupt. His story begs the question of where the line between a community leader and a criminal warlord truly lies, and how often that line is blurred not by the individual's actions alone, but by the needs and silences of the community itself. Furthermore, his deep entanglement with politics exposes the rotten core of a specific form of corruption, the institutionalization of illegality. This is not the one-off bribe for a favor. It is the systemic integration of criminal enterprise into the daily functioning of government. Police salaries, municipal contracts, election campaigns, all were budget line items in Kim's ledgers. This reveals a terrifying truth that the most dangerous criminal is not the one who defies the system, but the one who becomes an unofficial, unaccountable department within it. His power was so enduring precisely because it was baked into the process, make everyone from the beat cop to the assemblyman a stakeholder in its continuation. This complicity creates a culture of collective guilt and silence, a prison of fear more effective than any physical one, where the entire community becomes both victim and accomplice. His downfall, therefore, required not just a heroic prosecutor but a cataclysmic external shock, the 1997 financial crisis that shattered the national illusion of progress and forced a reckoning with the hidden costs of the miracle. On a philosophical level, Kim Tae-chon's life is a stark treatise on the emptiness of power derived solely from domination. He accumulated vast wealth, commanded fear, and bent institutions to his will, yet his legacy is one of utter desolation. He built no schools, funded no hospitals, left no positive mark on the culture of his city. His name is synonymous with shame, not respect, with a cancer that had to be cut out, not a foundation upon which something was built. This presents a fundamental paradox of criminal power. It is inherently ephemeral and self-cannibalizing because it is based on fear and transactional loyalty. It cannot create lasting loyalty or genuine social capital. It must constantly consume more money, more fear, more territory to sustain itself until it either collapses under its own weight or is destroyed by the very systems it sought to corrupt. His death in prison, isolated and irrelevant, is the logical endpoint of this philosophy. It asks us, what is power truly for if it does not create, protect, or inspire, but only controls and consumes? Is it power at all, or merely a sophisticated form of societal predation? His story also serves as a grim lesson about the nature of legacy. Kim Tae-chon undoubtedly believed he was building a dynasty, an enduring criminal kingdom that would outlast him. Instead, he became a catalyst for the very reforms that would make it harder for anyone to follow his path. His most enduring legacy is the strengthened anti-corruption laws, the more vigilant press, and the public awareness in Busan that followed his exposure. He is remembered not as a master architect, but as the subject of a cautionary tale, a benchmark for how bad things can get. In a cruel irony, the man who sought to make himself a permanent fixture became the agent of his own permanent erasure, a figure studied only to ensure his like does not rise again. Finally, his narrative challenges our simplistic notions of justice. Was his life sentence and lonely death sufficient justice for the systemic harm he caused? The individuals he maimed or bankrupted? The police force he corrupted? The democrat faith he poisoned? Can such damage ever be truly adjudicated by a court? The legal justice he received was procedural and personal, but the societal justice is ongoing, measured in the daily commitment of Busan's citizens and officials to reject the model he represented. In the end, the story of Kim Tae-chon is a story about shadows. He was the shadow of Korea's economic miracle, the shadow of its political centralization, the shadow of its regional pride. His rise proves how long and dark those shadows can grow when the light of transparency, accountability, and civic courage is dim. His fall proves that no show, no matter how deep or widespread, can ultimately withstand the relentless collective will to turn on the light. His life stands as a monument to a terrible potential within modernizing societies, and his death a reminder that the most secure prison for such a figure is not made of concrete and steel, but of historical oblivion and the resolved memory of a people who chose to stop being afraid. The dismantling of Kim Tae-chon's empire hinged on a perilous and unprecedented human experiment, the protection of those who dared to betray him, the state's ability to safeguard its star witness, Jang Myung-soo, and to insulate its lead prosecutor, Lee In-kiai, from the retaliatory reach of the syndicate, was as critical to the case's success as the ledger itself. This shadow war of security and survival, fought in safe houses and through assumed identities, forms a crucial, often overlooked chapter in the story, revealing the immense personal cost of confronting a network criminal state. For Jang Myung-soo, the moment he handed over the floppy disks, his old life ceased to exist. He was immediately extracted into the fledgling witness protection program of South Korea, a system that was, at the time, severely tested by the magnitude of the threat he faced. Kim Tae-chon's tentacles extended nationwide. His wrath was legendary. Jang's protection was not a mere relocation. It was a total annihilation of his former identity. He was given a new name, a new birth date, a fabricated personal history complete with educational and employment records seeded into official databases. His physical appearance was altered haircut, glasses, sometimes even minor dental work. He was moved through a series of secure locations, first within South Korea, and as the trial proceeded, and the threat was deemed international in scope, potentially overseas, his family, if they agreed, were also incorporated into this life of shadow, their connections to their past severed for their own safety. The psychological toll was immense. Jang had traded the terror of Kim's vengeance for the loneliness of a ghostly existence. He could never contact old friends, visit his hometown, or practice any profession that might draw attention. He lived with the constant low-grade anxiety of being recognized, fear that never fully dissipates, even with the best security protocols. The state, in return for his testimony, offered not just protection but a negotiated sentence for his own crimes, a reduction that acknowledged his pivotal role but did not erase his past complicity. His testimony during the trial was delivered from behind a screen, his voice distorted, a spectral presence in the courtroom that was the final, damning voice of Kim's own meticulous record-keeping. After the trials concluded, Jang Myung-soo didn't simply walk free. He disappeared into the machinery of the state's protection, his ultimate fate a closely guarded secret. Whether he built a quiet, anonymous life elsewhere, always looking over his shoulder, or whether the strain of his double life took its own toll, remains unknown. His legacy is the ledger. His personal story ends where the public record stops, a necessary sacrifice for the greater judicial truth. For prosecutor Lee in KYU, the danger was of a different, more insidious kind. He was a public figure, his name and face synonymous with the case. He could not be hidden. His protection was therefore a matter of constant, overt security detail and a life under siege. From the moment the investigation became public, Lee and his immediate family lived with round-the-clock armed guards. His children were escorted to and from school by plainclothes officers. His home was fitted with panic buttons and surveillance systems. His commute followed randomized routes. The threats were not empty. He received countless anonymous letters and phone calls promising graphic retribution. There were credible intelligence reports of plots against his life, necessitating even more stringent measures. His professional life became a minefield. The powerful enemies he made, the disgraced politicians, the corrupt business elites, the network of sympathizers still loyal to the old order worked to undermine him through legalistic harassment, smear in sympathetic media outlets, and bureaucratic obstruction. Promotions that should have been automatic were delayed. Prestigious postings were denied under the guise of needing his unique expertise in less influential roles. The cost was personal and profound. The relentless pressure strained his family life. His health suffered from the constant stress and the weight of knowing that thousands of lives, including his own family's safety, depended on his unwavering resolve, was a solitary burden. Yet, Lee in KYU became a symbol of a new possibility in Korean jurisprudence. The prosecutor as an untouchable, incorruptible force. His success, though career-limiting in the traditional, clubby sense, inspired a generation of young legal professionals. He proved that, with enough forensic diligence and moral courage, even the most fortified criminal political complex could be taken down. In the years following the Kim Tae-chon case, Lee did not ascend to the political or high judicial posts that often reward such fame. Instead, he often remained in specialized anti-corruption and organized crime units, a mentor to younger prosecutors, a living institutional memory of how it was done. His legacy is not a statue, but a precedent, a case file that is studied in law schools, a proof that the witness protection program could work, and that a prosecutor could survive the wrath of an emperor. The fates of these two men, the witness and the prosecutor, bookend the human cost of justice in the face of systemic evil. One was erased to speak the truth. The other had to magnify his presence to defend it. Both lived lives permanently altered by their encounter with Kim Tae-chon's shadow. Their stories underscore a sobering reality. Defeating such entrenched power requires not just legal acumen, but a form of secular martyrdom, a willingness to sacrifice one's own peace, identity, and future on the altar of public accountability. The silent, ongoing existence of Jang Myung-soo and the guarded, principled career of Lee in Kiwoyu are the living, breathing epilogues to the Kim Tae-chon saga. They are the human proof that the ledger was not just a document, but a catalyst that demanded and consumed extraordinary personal courage, reminding us that behind every historic conviction for high-level corruption there are individuals who must quite literally vanish or stand eternally vigilant so that the light of justice can finally reach the darkest rooms of power. The economic landscape of Busan in the wake of Kim Tae-chon's downfall resembled a city after a particularly insidious form of bombardment, where the infrastructure appeared intact but the foundational rules governing it had been vaporized. The sudden, surgical removal of his syndicate from the construction industry and the broader economy did not trigger a celebratory boom, but rather a protracted, painful period of detoxification, market correction, and institutional rehabilitation. For nearly 2 decades, Kim's network had functioned as a shadow central bank and a de facto regulatory agency for vast swathes of Busan's commerce, particularly in public works. Its abrupt absence created a vacuum that was, in the short term, as destabilizing as its presence had been corrosive. The most immediate and visible impact was the paralysis in the public construction sector. Dozens of major projects from port expansions and highway interchanges to public housing complexes and municipal buildings were suddenly frozen. These were projects tainted at their source, their contracts illegitimate, their financing streams linked to forfeited criminal assets. A daunting audit process began, spearheaded by emergency committees from the central government in Seoul, to untangle which projects could be salvaged through retendering and which had to be scrapped entirely. This caused massive delays, cost overruns for the state, and threw thousands of legitimate construction workers, engineers, and subcontractors into limbo. Their livelihoods had been indirectly tied to the corrupt system. Now they paid the price for its collapse. The network of shell companies and front businesses that laundered Kim's money imploded. Banks, terrified of regulatory backlash, froze accounts and called in loans not only from the indicted companies but from any firm perceived to have been in their orbit. This credit crunch hit small and medium-sized businesses especially hard, many of whom had been coerced into unfavorable partnerships or were simply caught in the indiscriminate fallout. The vibrant, if fear-tinged, nightlife economy in districts like Seomyeon also seized up. Clubs and bars that had paid protection money to Kim's enforcers now found themselves dealing with a new, unpredictable array of smaller gangs, while also facing increased, and now genuinely rigorous, police scrutiny for licensing and safety violation. The sense of a regulated underworld was gone, replaced by a more chaotic and volatile criminal marketplace. However, from this short-term chaos emerged the painful but necessary seeds of long-term reform. The most profound change was the death of the Yongtae bid-rigging system. The scandal led to the implementation of stringent new public procurement laws. Electronic bidding systems were introduced to enhance transparency. Bid evaluation committees were restructured to include outside civil auditors, and the penalties for collusion were increased to existential levels for companies. For the first time in a generation, local construction firms had to compete on actual cost, technical merit, and project management capability. This forced a massive industry-wide restructuring. The old, well-connected but inefficient companies that had thrived under Kim's patronage withered. New, more agile, and professionally managed firms began to emerge. The very definition of a competitive advantage shifted from who you knew and who you could intimidate to what you could build, how efficiently and at what price. This transition was brutal and not all companies survived it, but it ultimately made the Busan construction sector more resilient and legitimate, better integrated into the national and even international market. The scandal also catalyzed a shift in Busan's economic identity. The city could no longer rely on a model where rapid, gangster-facilitated construction was a primary economic engine. This forced city planners and business leaders to consciously diversify. Greater emphasis was placed on leveraging Busan's inherent strengths as a port city, logistics, international trade, and tourism. The successful bid to host the 2002 Asian Games and the later push to become a convention hub were part of this conscious pivot away from the shadow of the past. Investment began to flow into technology parks, cruise ship terminals, and cultural amenity sectors less easily monopolized through brute force and political bribery. Furthermore, the collective trauma instilled a deep, lasting aversion to the of opaque, relationship-based deal-making that had characterized the chimera. Business associations instituted stricter ethical codes. A new generation of entrepreneurs and managers, educated in a more globalized and transparent business environment, viewed the old ways not as savvy but as suicidal. The scandal became a permanent part of corporate onboarding, a warning of what happens when business and crime embrace. Financially, the state's forfeiture of Kim's assets, while a moral victory, was also a complex logistical undertaking that injected a one-time surge of funds back into public coffers, but also highlighted how much wealth had been diverted. The process of liquidating his holdings from real estate and company share to luxury vehicles took years, and was itself scrutinized for transparency. On a human level, the economic detoxification created both victims and beneficiaries. The victims were the small business owners who had been bankrupted by his loan sharking the worker, displaced by the frozen projects, and the legitimate companies unfairly tarred by association. The beneficiaries, in the long run, were the citizens of Busan, who would eventually benefit from more competitively priced and better built public infrastructure, and from a business environment where innovation and efficiency slowly began to outweigh connections and coercion. The economic aftermath of Kim Tae-chon is a masterclass in the hidden costs of corruption. It shows that the price is not just paid in bribes, but in distorted markets, stifled innovation, misallocated public resources, and a collective entrepreneurial spirit shackled by fear. The recovery was not a return to a pre-Kim normal, for that normal was the disease itself. Instead, it was a slow, arduous construction of a new normal, one built on the fragile but essential foundations of transparency and rule of law. The cranes that eventually returned to Busan's skyline did so under a different set of rules, serving as silent, metallic witnesses to a city struggling to build its future with clean hands, having learned the hardest of lessons that economic growth purchased with corruption is a loan from hell, and the interest eventually due can cripple a city for a generation. The relationship between Kim Tae-chon and the media in Busan was not one of overt censorship through force, but rather a sophisticated, chilling symbiosis of silence, self-censorship, and coerced compliance that rendered his empire almost invisible in the public sphere for the majority of his reign. This media blackout, more effective than any official decree, was a cornerstone of his power, allowing his influence to grow unchecked in the shadows of public awareness. The mechanisms of this control were multifaceted and insidious. At the most basic level was the ever-present threat of violent retaliation. Reporters who ventured too close to stories about his construction racket or political connections received anonymous, graphic warnings: a dead rat left in a car, a funeral wreath delivered to a newsroom, a whispered threat to a journalist's family during a late-night phone call. These were not empty gestures, they were promises. In a close-knit city like Busan, where everyone knew someone who knew someone connected to the syndicate, the message was profoundly clear. Some stories were lethal, beyond direct intimidation. Kim wielded a more subtle and powerful tool: economic pressure. His syndicate, through its labyrinth of front companies and affiliated businesses, was a significant source of advertising revenue for local newspapers and broadcasters. A newspaper that ran an exposé would suddenly find key advertisers pulling their contracts not with an explanation, but with a cold, final silence. Furthermore, many media outlets themselves were commercial entities that needed permits, faced zoning issues, or required cooperation from City Hall, all domains where Kim's influence was paramount. A critical story could lead to sudden, inexplicable bureaucratic hurdles that choked the business side of the news organization. This created an environment where editors and publishers practiced preemptive self-censorship, killing stories at the rumor stage to protect their staff, their revenue, and their own operational viability. The silence was also maintained through the corruption of the media's traditional sources. The police, who should have been providing crime statistics and information, were on Kim's payroll. Politicians who might have leaked scandals about rivals were often in his debt. Even the judicial system, in Busan at least, was compromised. This meant that for a journalist, the official channels for verifying a story about Kim were not just uncooperative, they were actively hostile and dangerous. The fourth pillar of media control was narrative framing. On the rare occasions when Kim's name could not be avoided, such as when he was tangentially linked to a violent incident, the coverage was carefully neutered. He was referred to with vague, non-confrontational labels like a well-known businessman or a figure in the construction industry. The language was passive, the connections hinted at but never stated, the scale of his operations never detailed. This created a public consciousness that knew of a shadowy figure named Kim Tae-chon but lacked the concrete reportorial facts to understand his true power, allowing myth and fear to fill the information vacuum. This enforced silence was a profound betrayal of the public trust, making the local media, wittingly or unwittingly, an accomplice to his reign. The dramatic transformation following his arrest in 2000 was, therefore, not just a shift in coverage but a volcanic eruption of long-suppressed truth and a collective professional reckoning. The dam broke when prosecutor Lee in KIU's team, operating from Seoul, began to selectively and confidently release evidence to the national media. For the first time, journalists had hard, incontrovertible facts, names, dates, amount, ledgers provided by a source with the authority and will to protect them. The Busan media, initially stunned and shamed into paralysis, soon found itself racing to catch up, terrified of being left behind by the national outlets that were now feasting on the story. A fierce sense of penitent competition took hold. Investigative teams were formed, old files were reopened, and sources who had been too afraid to speak for decades now found courageous journalists ready to listen, their notepads out, their recorders on, under the new protective umbrella of a national spotlight and a prosecutor's office that was finally on their side. The coverage that followed was a cathartic deluge. Newspapers published sprawling, multi-part series mapping his empire. Television networks aired dramatic documentaries with flowcharts of corruption and interviews with trembling victims. The euphemisms vanished. He was now openly called a gangster, a crime boss, the head of a corrupt syndicate. Every facet of his life and operation was dissected. His early years, his business fronts, his political connections, his brutal enforcement methods. The media became the essential translator of the complex legal and financial evidence for the public, playing a crucial role in maintaining the intense pressure that prevented the scandal from being swept under the rug. This period also forced a painful introspection within Busan's journalistic community. There were public apologies, resignations of editors who had bowed to pressure, and earnest debates about the failure of their civic duty. It led to institutional reforms within newsrooms, the establishment of stronger protections for whistleblowers, more secure channel for tip-offs, and a renewed emphasis on investigative journalism funded independently of local advertising pressures. The Kim Tae-chon case became the foundational trauma and the ultimate benchmark for the Busan press. It proved that the cost of silence was far greater than the cost of truth. In the years that followed, while the intense spotlight eventually dimmed, the lesson remained. The media in Busan became noticeably more aggressive in covering local corruption and political misdeeds, aware that their previous failure had allowed a cancer to metastasize. The ghost of Kim Tae-chon, therefore, haunts the newsrooms of the city in a positive way as a permanent reminder of the stakes of their profession. His story underscores a universal truth about authoritarian power, whether political or criminal. It cannot survive in the full, sustained glare of a free and fearless press. His reign flourished in silence and shows. His downfall was hastened, explained, and cemented by a media finally unleashed, turning from a pillar of his power into the loudspeaker of his disgrace, proving that the pen, when finally wielded with courage, can indeed be mightier than the sword, the bribe, and the whispered threat. Behind the public persona of the ruthless emperor lay a private world shrouded in even deeper shadow, a domestic life that was both a refuge from his criminal enterprises and yet utterly defined and ultimately devastated by them. Kim Tae-chon was, by all accounts, a fiercely private family man, but his concept of family was inevitably warped by the nature of his power. He married and had children, constructing for them a life of immense luxury and profound isolation, a gilded cage whose bars were made of his notoriety and the ever-present threat of retaliation. His family resided not in an ostentatious gangster's mansion that would draw attention, but in a series of upscale, high-security apartments and villas in the most affluent neighborhoods of Busan, their homes fortresses of silence. The children attended elite private schools, but under assumed surnames or with a protective detail hovering discreetly in the background, ensuring they were never victims of kidnapping, but also marking them as fatally different from their peers. The paradox of their existence was total. They enjoyed every material privilege imaginable, funded by extortion and bribery, yet lived in a world where trust was impossible, where friendships were scrutinized for security risks, and where their father's name was a word spoken in hushed, fearful tones outside their insulated bubble. Kim reportedly maintained a strict separation between his business and family life, common trait among powerful criminals who seek to preserve a semblance of normalcy. He was said to be a devoted, if stern, father, demanding academic excellence and discipline, perhaps hoping to steer his children toward the legitimate success he could only mimic. Yet, the very foundation of their wealth and safety was the violence and corruption he orchestrated. This created an inescapable psychological prison for his wife and children. They were beneficiaries of a crime spree, yet also its potential primary victims, targets for rivals or law enforcement seeking leverage. The wife, whose name and image were scrupulously kept from the media, lived a life of perpetual anxiety, managing a household under constant surveillance, both her own and potentially that of enemies, knowing that her husband's world was one where today's luxury could be tomorrow's ruin. The children grew up with a dual consciousness, the private father who provided and demanded respect, and the public specter of Kim Tae-chon, the gangster whose legend was woven from fear. This schism between the private man and the public monster is a recurring theme in the lives of criminal kingpins, but it does not absolve the domestic reality. It merely makes it a more complex tragedy. The family was the one human vulnerability Kim could not eliminate, the one part of his empire he could not fully control with ledger entries and intimidation. When his downfall came, it was catastrophic for them. The dawn raids that took him away also shattered their world. Their homes were seized as criminal assets, their bank accounts frozen, their luxurious possessions catalogued as evidence. The protective veil of fear that had once shielded them was ripped away, replaced by the blinding, humiliating glare of public scandal. They became pariahs, their name a synonym for corruption. The children, whether still in school or entering adulthood, found their futures incinerated. The elite universities and professional paths that were once guaranteed were now closed, their family name a permanent stain. They faced not only the loss of wealth, but the burden of a legacy of shame and hatred from the very city they called home. The social ostracism was absolute. Friends and acquaintances vanished, terrified of association. They were hounded by the media, their faces once carefully protected now splashed across newspapers as the family of the disgraced mobster. The wife, who had managed the private fortress, now had to navigate a legal and financial nightmare dealing with asset forfeiture proceedings, lawyers' fees, and the crushing loneliness of her situation. There are no public records of her fate, but it is a safe assumption that her later life was one of quiet, impoverished obscurity. A widow to a man who died in prison long before his physical death. The children were forced to change their names, to disperse, to attempt to build anonymous lives, far from Busan, carrying the psychological scars of a childhood that was both privileged and traumatic, loving a father who was also a societal monster. They are the forgotten casualties of Kim Tae-chon's ambition, human evidence that the cost of such a life is never borne by the criminal alone. His desire to provide for his family through crime ultimately ensured their ruin. His love for them, however genuine in his own terms, became the instrument of their lasting suffering. This familial dimension adds a profound layer of pathos to his story. It reveals the ultimate emptiness of his project. He sought to build an enduring legacy, a dynasty of power and wealth. Instead, he left a legacy of disgrace that his own bloodline must forever flee. He could corrupt police and politicians, but he could not corrupt the judgment of history or shield his family from its consequences. His children did not inherit an empire. They inherited a curse. Their silent, scattered lives today are the final verdict on his life's work. A demonstration that power rooted in the suffering of others poisons everything it touches, even, and especially, the intimate bonds it purports to protect. The story of Kim Tae-chon's family is thus the most human and devastating chapter of his saga, a reminder that behind the headlines of gangsters and grafters, shattered homes and broken lives, and that the most secure prison he built was not the one he entered in Daejeon, but the invisible one he constructed for those he claimed to love, a prison of shame, loss, and a surname that can never be spoken with pride. The figure of Kim Tae-chon, in the years following his spectacular downfall, underwent a fascinating and complex metamorphosis in the South Korean cultural consciousness, evolving from a living specter of fear into a multifaceted symbol woven into the fabric of society's understanding of power, corruption, and justice. This cultural digestion of his story happened across a spectrum, from the whispered folklore of the streets to the polished narratives of mainstream media, each layer reflecting a different facet of the nation's trauma and catharsis. In the immediate aftermath of his arrest and trial, the dominant cultural narrative was one of journalistic exposé and judicial triumph. He was the monster unmasked, the central villain in a national morality play. Television documentaries, often titled with dramatic epithets like The Fall of the Emperor or Busan's Shadow, used grainy footage, somber voiceovers, and animated corruption maps to lay bare his empire. These were less works of art than public autopsies, serving a vital civic function of education and collective processing. They solidified his image in the public mind as the archetype of the Jigs criminal, the one embedded in the system. He became the benchmark against which all other corruption scandals were measured. In political cartoons, he was depicted as a grotesque octopus, his tentacles strangling City Hall, police stations, and the National Assembly, a visual shorthand for institutional capture that every citizen instantly understood. This period was about demystification through facts, an attempt to replace the fearful rumors with the sobering reality of ledgers and prison sentences. As the shock subsided, a more nuanced and at times troubling cultural archetype began to emerge, particularly in popular entertainment. Kim Tae-chon's life story contained the raw elements of a classic gangster saga: the rise from poverty, the cunning intelligence, the creation of a vast empire, the fatal flaw of hubris, and the tragic fall. This narrative proved irresistible to filmmakers and television producers, though direct biographical depictions were avoided due to legal sensitivities and the raw nerves of those still affected. Instead, his essence was fictionalized and blended into characters. The cold, strategic, and politically connected mobster became a recurring trope in Korean crime dramas and films. These characters were not the hot-headed, tattooed street thugs of earlier genres. They were sophisticated CEOs of crime, wearing tailored suits, speaking in calm, measured tones, and operating from boardrooms. Their violence administrative and delegated. This fictional refraction allowed the public to engage with the phenomenon of Kim Tae-chon at a safe, metaphorical distance, exploring the allure and the horror of such power without confronting the specific victims. In some of these depictions, there was even a dangerous undercurrent of dark romanticization, a grudging admiration for his sheer audacity and strategic genius, a portrayal that sometimes risked blurring the line between condemnation and fascination. This mirrored a paradoxical thread in the public's relationship with such figures, a deep-seated resentment of their crimes coexisting with a cynical understanding that his success revealed systemic rot, making him a perverse symptom rather than an alien pathogen. Beyond mainstream media, a more visceral folklore persisted in Busan itself. In the city's bars and taxi cabs, stories about Kim Tae-chon took on a legendary, almost mythical quality. Tales were told of his supposed generosity to certain ordinary people in his old neighborhood, a classic trope of the Robin Hood-like gangster. Though thoroughly contradicted by the historical record of his predatory greed, other stories amplified his brutality into the realm of horror whispers of secret underground interrogation rooms, of enemy disappearing into the sea, weighted with concrete, of his ability to know anything that was said about him in the city. This oral folklore served multiple purposes. It was a way for a traumatized city to own and narrate its own dark history, to transform a period of collective powerlessness into a saga with a clear, defeated villain. It also functioned as a lasting cautionary tale for the business and political class, a ghost story used to warn against the temptation of shortcuts and shady partnerships. Remember what happened to those who danced with Kim Tae-chon became an unspoken maxim. His name was invoked as the ultimate example of a road not to travel. In academia and serious non-fiction, his case became a staple subject of study in law, criminology, and political science courses. Textbooks analyzed the Busan model of criminal-political symbiosis. Scholars debated whether he was a cause or a consequence of Korea's developmental dictatorship hangover. His ledgers were pored over as primary documents in the study of corruption networks. In this sphere, he was stripped of all myth and rendered into data points, flowcharts, and case studies, his humanity secondary to his function. As a historical exemplar of institutional failure, this analytical treatment ensured his story would be passed on not as folklore, but as a critical lesson in governance for future generations. The most profound cultural impact, however, was intangible. Kim Tae-chon entered the Korean language as a metaphorical reference. To call a politician or businessman a small Kim Tae-chon was the ultimate accusation of corrupt, behind-the-scenes manipulation. His story fundamentally altered the public's expectation of transparency. It made citizens more skeptical, more demanding of accountability, and less trusting of the cozy relationships between local power brokers. He became a ghost in the machine of Korean democracy, a specter whose memory was invoked to justify stronger anti-corruption laws, a free press, and the work of prosecutors like Lee and Kyu. Culturally, he was no longer just a man. He was an era, a syndrome, a lesson. His journey from feared emperor to studied case file to fictional trope and cautioner whisper encapsulates how a society metabolizes its most traumatic breaches of trust. The Kim Tae-chon that exists in South Korea today is a composite, part historical monster, part dramatic anti-hero, part academic case study, and part folk devil. This multifaceted presence is perhaps the final proof of his significance. He was not a mere criminal to be forgotten, but a seismic event in the nation's social fabric whose aftershocks in the form of stories, laws, archetypes, and warnings continue to be felt, ensuring that the Emperor of Busan in death remains a potent, if deeply unsettling, part of the national conversation about who we are and what we must never allow ourselves to become again. While Kim Tae-chon's empire was profoundly local, its roots sunk deep into the specific soil of Busan's political and economic ecosystem. Nature of his wealth and the globalizing world of the late 20th century inevitably created faint but discernible international filaments. His was not a transnational cartel in the manner of the Italian mafia, Japanese yakuza, or Mexican drug lords, with formalized branches overseas. Instead, his international connections were pragmatic, financial, and secondary to his domestic power base, reflecting the needs of a criminal enterprise maturing into a capital-rich entity seeking to preserve and grow its assets beyond the reach of national authorities. The primary international dimension of his syndicate was financial laundering and asset stashing. The vast profits from bid rigging, extortion, and loan sharking profits measured in hundreds of billions of won needed to be cleansed and secured. This required moving money across borders. Investigations revealed the use of classic trade-based money laundering techniques, for instance, over-invoicing for imported construction equipment or luxury goods through front companies with the excess value being deposited in overseas accounts. Shell companies were registered in traditional secrecy havens like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and possibly Macau, creating layered corporate veils that made tracing the ultimate beneficial ownership nearly impossible for contemporary Korean investigators. There were also indications of investments in overseas real estate, particularly in Southeast Asia, as a means of parking capital in appreciating assets far from the prying eyes of the Korean National Tax Service. These international financial maneuvers were not the core of his business, but its necessary appendix, a life support system for his illicit wealth. Furthermore, Busan's identity as a major international port presented natural, if cautiously explored, avenues for expansion. There were persistent, though never conclusively proven, intelligence reports and rumors of His syndicate's involvement in the smuggling of contraband through the port, not necessarily narcotics, which was a less prevalent market in Korea at the time and riskier, but higher value goods like counterfeit luxury items, stolen electronics, or untaxed cigarettes. The control he exerted over port unions and logistics companies through intimidation and corruption would have provided the perfect infrastructure for such activities. Some analysts have speculated on potential indirect connections to Korean, Japanese criminal networks, the Joseonjok gangs, or Chinese triads, particularly in the realms of gambling and underground finance, leveraging Busan's proximity to Japan and its historic Chinese community. However, these remained in the realm of conjecture. Kim's genius was in dominating a localized system, not in managing the complexities of international criminal alliances, which would have diluted his control and introduced new threats. When compared to other global organized crime figures, Kim Tae-chon stands out not for the geographic scale of his operations, but for the depth of his political and institutional penetration. Unlike a Pablo Escobar, whose power was built on the global cocaine trade and a war against the state, Kim's power was built on becoming a part of the state. Unlike a Semyon Mogilevich, the Russian boss of bosses who operated a vast, decentralized international network across multiple continents and criminal sectors, Kim's world was geographically compact but institutionally suffocating. His closest global analogues are figures like Italy's Salvatore Totorina of the Corleonesi Mafia or Japan's Yoshinori Watanabe of the Yamaguchi-gumi, who also sought to wield direct political power and instill systemic fear. Yet, even here, the comparison diverges. The Italian mafia, with its centuries-old codes and familial structures, and the Yakuza, with their open corporate offices and semi-legal status for much of their history, existed in a different cultural and historical context. Kim's organization was a more modern, corporate-style entity, born of Korea's compressed, hyper-capitalist development. His true peer might be found in other crony capitalist gangsters of Asia's rapid growth era, such as China's Lai Changxing, whose smuggling empire corrupted an entire coastal province in the 1990s, or even figures within the chaotic post-Soviet states who captured regional governments. What makes Kim uniquely Korean was the specific interface of his criminality with the nation's chaebol-style corporate culture and its regionally based political patronage systems. He didn't just bribe individuals, he effectively ran a parallel criminal civil service. His international legacy, therefore, is not one of a global crime lord, but of a case study for other nations, for international law enforcement agencies like the FBI and Interpol. The Kim Tae-chon case became a textbook example of state capture by organized crime at a subnational level. It demonstrated how a syndicate could neutralize law enforcement not by outgunning it, but by payrolling it. For developing nations grappling with corruption in public procurement, his story served as a dire warning of how bid rigging can fund a criminal state within a state. His relatively limited international footprint also highlights a key truth about organized crime. Its most devastating form is often not the one that crosses oceans, but the one that sinks its roots so deep into a specific community's institutions that it becomes indistinguishable from them. The global wires of finance he touched were merely tools to service this localized dominion. In the end, Kim Tae-chon's world was the port city of Busan, its city hall, its police precincts, and its construction sites. His international connections were the tendrils of a deeply domestic parasite seeking safe havens for its nourishment. This insulated focus was both his strength and his ultimate weakness. It allowed him to build an impregnable local fortress, but it also meant that when the fortress was finally breached from within by a ledger and a determined prosecutor, he had no foreign redoubt to flee to, no international network powerful enough to shield him. He fell as definitively as he had risen, a king whose kingdom, for all its terrifying reach within its borders, extended not much further than the horizons visible from the hills of Busan, a reminder that the most absolute power is often the most geographically confined, and thus, when the foundations finally shake, the most utterly inescapable. The prison cell that became Kim Tae-chon's final domain was a universe away from the metaphorical seat of power he once occupied, meticulous, controlled environment designed to enforce not just punishment but a complete annihilation of the autonomy he had spent a lifetime cultivating. Following his final sentencing, he was placed in the high-security wing of Daejeon Correctional Institution, a facility chosen for its distance from his Busan power base and its capability to manage high-profile, high-risk inmates. His daily existence was stripped to a bare, monotonous routine, a stark and relentless contrast to the dynamic, command-driven life of an emperor. His cell was a solitary concrete box approximately 6 square meters, containing a fixed bunk, a small stainless steel sink and toilet, a shelf for personal items severely limited in his case, and a small desk. The lighting was controlled from outside, the door a solid slab of metal, with a narrow food slot and a peephole for guards. For a man accustomed to vast offices, luxury hotels, and the freedom of the city he owned, this physical confinement was a profound sensory deprivation. The regimentation was absolute. His day began at 6 a.m. with a wake-up call via intercom. He would be allowed out for a brief, solitary exercise period in a high-walled, open-air cage, often under the watch of multiple guards. Showers were limited to specific, short durations, several times a week, in a secured stall. Meals, bland, state-issued portions of rice, soup, and side dishes were delivered through the slot. He spent most of his day in the cell, with limited access to a small, heavily monitored prison library. He was permitted a television and a radio, but the channels were restricted to state-approved broadcasts, a cruel reminder of a world he could observe but no longer influence. All his communications were a source of intense scrutiny. Family visits, rare and emotionally charged affairs, were conducted through thick plexiglass partitions using monitored telephones. His lawyer's visits were the only breaks in the isolation. Even these were recorded and observed. His mail, both incoming and outgoing, was read and censored by prison authorities. This total surveillance was the state's answer to his former omniscience in Busan. Now he was the one perpetually observed, his every word and action a potential piece of evidence in ongoing investigations, or a security risk to be managed. Psychologically, this environment was a form of exquisite torture for a strategic mind like his. The lack of stimulus, the absence of problems to solve or people to command, the sheer uselessness of his once keen intellect in this controlled vacuum must have been maddening. Reports from guards and rare snippets from monitored conversations suggested a man cycling through phases of sullen withdrawal, furious but impotent rage, and deep depression. He was known to spend hours writing, filling notebooks with dense script, legal arguments, instruction for his dwindling number of loyal lawyers, and likely rambling justifications of his life. These writings were confiscated and reviewed, never to be made public, the fine, futile output of a brain that had once moved markets and dictated fates. His health became a central feature of his imprisonment. The stress, bitterness, and sedentary life took a rapid toll. He developed hypertension and diabetes, conditions managed with medication dispensed by the prison clinic. The once powerful physique, accustomed to the deference of boardrooms and golf courses, began to deteriorate. The diagnosis of liver cancer in the mid-2000s added a layer of medical bureaucracy to his confinement. Treatment was provided, but within the constraints of the prison infirmary. He was transferred to the prison hospital ward, a slightly larger but equally sterile room, now filled with the sounds and smells of sickness. This phase represented the ultimate stripping of dignity. The emperor, who had commanded fear, was now a patient, dependent on the care of state employees, subject to the humiliations of illness. The cancer treatment, likely chemotherapy, would have been grueling even in the best circumstances. Within a prison, it was a uniquely bleak ordeal. Throughout this, Kim reportedly maintained his core defiance. He never participated in any rehabilitation programs, never expressed public remorse, never acknowledged the authority of the system that held him beyond a brute fact to be endured. His identity remained fixed. He was Kim Tae-chon, wronged and deposed. This unyielding posture isolated him even from other inmates and guards. He was a statue of resentment in a world of concrete. The state, for its part, was determined to ensure he served as a symbol of irreversible justice. There was no special treatment, no unofficial privileges that could be purchased. His name meant nothing here, It was only a number and a security classification. The contrast with his former life could not have been more absolute. Where once a glance from him could silence a room, now he had to request permission for a pencil. Where once he decided the economic fortunes of thousands, now he had no agency over his next meal. Where once his silence was a weapon that induced fear, now it was merely the sound of his own irrelevance. The decade he spent in this environment was a slow, systematic deconstruction of the very concept of Kim Tae-chon. The man who entered prison in 2000, though in custody, still carried the aura of the untouchable emperor. The man who died in 2009 was a cancer patient in a prison infirmary. His power, wealth, and legend all reduced to a guarded medical file. His daily life behind bars was the ultimate, grinding conclusion to his story, not a dramatic shootout or a last escape, but the mundane, humiliating, and relentless process of being made ordinary, of being turned into just another inmate whose time was running out. A living lesson that in the end, the state's most powerful punishment is not the taking of a life, but the meticulous, soul-crushing negation of everything that life believed made it powerful. The long-term psychological impact of the Kim Tae-chon era on the citizen of Busan is a complex tapestry woven from threads of collective trauma, lingering distrust, a hardened civic resolve, and a paradoxical region pride that has been forced to reconcile with its darkest chapter. For a generation that lived under the silent weight of his reign, the exposure and dismantling of his empire was less a liberation and more a profound psychological rupture, a forced awakening from a nightmare they had learned to navigate while asleep. The initial dominant emotion in the aftermath was a deep and pervasive sense of betrayal. This betrayal was multifaceted: betrayal by the police, who were sworn to protect them but were on a criminal's payroll; betrayal by local politicians who had sworn oaths to the public but served a shadowy master; betrayal by the very institutions that were supposed to be the pillars of community life. This betrayal bred a cynicism that became embedded in the city's psyche. A default skepticism toward authority, particularly local authority, became a lasting trait. Where once there might have been a naive trust in the pronouncements of City Hall or the local police chief, now there was an instinctual question: who benefits? This cynicism, while protective, also carried a cost, fostering a certain civic disengagement and a belief that the system was inherently rigged, a sentiment that took years of consistent transparency to even begin to erode. Intertwined with this was a profound sense of shame and embarrassment on a national stage. Busan, a city famous for its hardy independent and entrepreneurial spirit, the New York of Korea, found itself nationally synonymous with epic, institutionalized corruption. This wounded the city's pride deeply. In national discourse, jokes and derogatory comments about Busan-style business or Busan connections stung for years. This external stigma forced a painful introspection. It sparked a fierce internal debate about the city's identity. Was their famed toughness and clannish loyalty, their Busan, Satori accent and defiant independence, a strength that had been hijacked, or did it contain a latent weakness, a tendency toward insularity, and a prioritization of personal and regional connections over abstract rule of law that Kim Tae-chon had expertly exploited? This period of self-reckoning was necessary but painful, as a community had to dissect its own culture to understand how it had incubated such a monster. From this trauma, however, emerged a powerful countercurrent, a collective resolve to never allow such a shadow to fall again. The scandal became the foundational never-again moment for modern Busan. It fueled a grassroots demand for transparency that was unprecedented. Citizen watchdog groups proliferated, focusing on local government procurement and police conduct. The local media, shamed by its past silence, became notably more aggressive and investigative. This civic vigilance created a new kind of social pressure, making the old, opaque ways of doing business politically and socially riskier. The generation that witnessed the scandal firsthand, now parents, business owners, and community leaders, carried with them a heightened sensitivity to corruption, often instilling in their children a value for transparency and a warning about the perils of quick money and shady connection. This is perhaps the most significant psychological legacy: the internalization of anti-corruption as a civic virtue born not from abstract principle, but from lived, painful experience. The city's collective memory of the era is not monolithic. For those who were direct victims, business owners bankrupted by his loan sharks, competitors driven to ruin, individuals who suffered violence, the memory is a personal, unhealed wound, a private story of fear and loss often still untold. For the vast majority who were indirect victims, living in the climate of fear, the memory has morphed into a shared story, a dark folklore. Kim Tae-chon, in the city's memory, has become a mythic figure, but one stripped of any romanticism. He is the bogeyman whose story is used to warn against greed and moral compromise. Remember, the time of Kim Tae-chon is a shorthand for acknowledging how low the city fell and how much was lost, not just money, but trust, reputation, and years of genuine democratic development. This memory acts as a societal immune system, a psychic antibody against the return of such systemic corruption. Interestingly, the city's response has also been to overcompensate in its projection of a clean, modern image. The aggressive push for international events like the Asian Games and the Busan International Film Festival, the development of high-tech parks, and glamorous cultural complexity can be seen in part as a concerted effort to redefine the Busan brand, to overwrite the global memory of the crime lord with images of innovation, culture, and openness. This drive for renewal is a psychological coping mechanism, a city building a bright new facade not just for tourists, but for its own self-esteem. Today, the psychological impact is layered. For older residents, the Kim Tae-chon era is a vivid, personal history, a before and after marker in their lives. For the younger generation, it is a history lesson, a scandal they learned about in school or from parents, often met with disbelief that such a thing could have happened in their vibrant, modern city. This generational divide is itself a sign of healing. The trauma is receding from lived experience into recorded history, yet the underlying legacy, the ingrained skepticism, the value placed on transparency, the fierce protection of the city's hard-won cleaner reputation persists. Busan today is a city that remembers its wound, not with an open sore, but with the tough, knotted scar tissue of a lesson learned the hardest way possible. The psychological journey from complicit silence to traumatic exposure to vigilance. Self-policing defines modern Busan as much as its beaches and skyscrapers. The ghost of Kim Tae-chon, therefore, does not haunt the city as a fear, but as a caution, a permanent part of its civic conscience, ensuring that the emperor's most lasting legacy is not the empire he built, but the collective resolve he unintentionally forged to ensure that such an empire can never be built again. The collapse of Kim Tae-chon's empire did not eradicate organized crime in South Korea, but it fundamentally altered its DNA, scattering its components and forcing a painful evolution that made the rise of another figure of his singular scale and style not just unlikely, but nearly impossible within the same socio-political framework. His downfall served as a catastrophic extinction event for a specific genus of criminal, the political embedded, regionally monopolistic godfather who sought to become a parallel state. In the aftermath, the organized crime landscape fragmented, diversified, and modernized, adapting to a new Korea that was more democratic, more transparent, more technologically advanced, and far less tolerant of the brazen collusion he embodied. The immediate vacuum in Busan and other cities led not to a new king, but to a bloody and destabilizing war of succession among mid-level factions, which in turn provoked an aggressive and sustained crackdown from a national police force eager to prove its reformed credentials. This period of chaotic violence in the early 2000s, while terrifying in the short term, actually prevented any single entity from consolidating power. Law enforcement, now operating with greater independence from local political interference and armed with stronger anti-racketeering laws born from the Kim scandal, systematically dismantled these emerging groups, often using the same financial forensic techniques pioneered by prosecutor Lee in KYU. The old model of controlling a geographic territory and neighborhood, a district, an entire city through sheer intimidation and corrupt police protection became untenably risky. Instead, organized crime syndicates, now often called crime corporations, were forced to evolve. They became leaner, more decentralized, and more specialized. The focus shifted from dominating physical territories and labor unions to operating in less visible, more lucrative, and internationally connected fields Sophisticated cybercrime include voice phishing and online fraud, drug trafficking. As South Korea's domestic drug market began to grow, illegal online gambling and sports betting, and high-level financial crime, these activities required different skills, tech-savvy, international connections, financial acumen, and could be coordinated by small, insulated cells rather than large, hierarchical organizations with a visible street presence. This new generation of criminals are less likely to be feared local legends and more likely to be anonymous, globally connected entrepreneurs of illicit services, their power measured in cryptocurrency wallets, not in the number of city officials on their payroll. The political environment that nurtured Kim Tae-chon has also been irrevocably altered. The Busan Gate scandal seared into the national consciousness the catastrophic, reputational, and legal risks of collusion with organized crime. Politicians, even at the local level, now maintain a strict, publicly visible distance from any figures with underworld ties. The intense scrutiny from a revitalized media and citizen watchdog group makes the old, backroom deal-making infinitely more dangerous. While corruption certainly has not vanished, its mechanics have changed. It is more likely to involve complex legal bribery through consulting fees or campaign donations funneled through opaque legal structures rather than the crude monthly cash deliveries to police chiefs that Kim's ledgers documented. The systemic, institutionalized protection he enjoyed is a relic of a less transparent, more regionally autonomous past. Furthermore, the tools to combat such figures are now vastly more powerful. South Korea's digital infrastructure, a double-edged sword, allows for unprecedented financial surveillance. The National Tax Service and the Financial Intelligence Unit can track transactions with a sophistication unimaginable in the 1990s. Witness protection programs, though still imperfect, are more robust. And perhaps most importantly, the Kim Tae-chon case established a powerful legal and cultural precedent that such figures can be taken down, and that doing so makes heroes of prosecutors and ruins the lives of those who aid them. This precedent acts as a powerful deterrent. Could a figure of his scale emerge again? The answer is a qualified no, if by his scale we mean a single individual commanding a regional monopoly over core institutions through a blend of violence and systemic bribery. The conditions that created him a rapidly industrializing society with weak democratic institutions, strong regionalist loyalties, and a political culture of patronage have largely passed. However, the potential for significant, damaging criminal enterprise has not diminished, it has transformed. The greater threat today is not a local emperor, but a diffuse, adaptive network operating in the borderless realms of cyberspace and global finance. These networks can amass vast wealth and cause immense social harm without ever controlling a city hall or a police precinct. They are harder to personify, harder to prosecute, and their impact is less visibly dramatic, but potentially more widespread. In a sense, Kim Tae-chon may have been the last of a dying breed, the apex predator of a specific ecological niche that has since been paved over by modernity. His story stands as a closed chapter in the history of Korean organized crime, a masterful but ultimately doomed experiment in criminal state building. The underworld that exists in Korea today is a shadow of his in terms of political ambition, but it is a more resilient, elusive, and globally integrated shadow. It does not seek to rule the system from within. It seeks to exploit the system's gaps from the outside, make it in some ways a less immediately terrifying, but in other ways a more insidiously modern challenge. The empire of Kim Tae-chon was a fortress. When the walls were breached, it fell. The criminal enterprises of today are more like a virus, constantly mutating, finding new hosts, and resisting any single, definitive blow. Thus, while South Korea will almost certainly never see another Emperor of Busan, it remains engaged in a continuous, evolving battle against criminality whose face is no longer that of a defiant king in a courtroom, but a blurred avatar on a dark web forum, a testament to the fact that as society fortify themselves against the sins of their past, the nature of sin itself finds new forms. The saga of Kim Tae-chon transcends the specifics of Busan or South Korea to offer a timeless, grimly universal case study in the anatomy of corruption and the fragile mechanics of institutional resilience. His story is a master textbook on how power, when utterly divorced from ethic and accountability, operates, consolidates, and ultimately combusts. The first and most profound lesson is that the most dangerous form of criminal power is not that which confronts the state, but that which co-opts it. Kim did not build a rival to the government. He built a parasite within its vital organs. His genius was understanding that the real leverage points in a society are not the banks or the casinos, but the boring, procedural nodes of bureaucracy, the zoning office, the procurement committee, the police precinct roster. By systematically infecting these nodes with bribes and threats, he turned public authority into a private utility. This reveals a chilling truth about modern states. They are not monolithic fortresses, but complex networks of human actors. And where there is a network, there are points of failure that can be hacked. The lesson for any society is that the defense of democracy lies not in grand, rhetorical stands, but in the mundane, unglamorous fortification of these procedural nodes, ensuring fair hiring in civil services, protecting the independence of auditors, guaranteeing the anonymity of whistleblowers, and rotating officials in sensitive positions to prevent the deep personal alliances that form the bedrock of systemic corruption. The second lesson is about the economics of silence. Kim's empire was built on a currency of fear, but it was traded in a market of complicity. For every person he directly threatened, there were 10 who benefited, or simply looked away, because speaking up carried an immediate, high cost, while compliance offered a quieter life, a profitable contract, or a safe career. This created a perverse equilibrium where the crime was an open secret, known but unacknowledged, a classic example of what sociologists call pluralistic ignorance. The scandal's explosion proved that such equilibriums are stable only until the cost of silence outweighs the cost of speech. The 1997 financial crisis was that catalyst, altering the national calculus and making the hidden cost of corruption unbearably visible. This teaches us that combating entrenched corruption requires more than just brave individuals. It requires a shift in the collective cost-benefit analysis, often triggered by an external shock, that makes the status quo untenable for the silent majority. It underscores the vital need for a protected space for dissent, a free press, and independent judiciary, vibrant civil society to lower the personal risk of speaking truth to power before a catastrophic crisis forces the issue. The third lesson is about the illusion of invincibility that such power creates. Kim Tae-chon, like so many authoritarians and criminal kingpins before him, began to believe his own myth. The ledgers, the very instruments of his control, became the artifacts of his hubris. In meticulously recording his corruption, he created a single point of catastrophic failure. He failed to understand that in a digitalizing world, information is the most volatile substance of all. His downfall was not due to a rival's army or a police crackdown, but from a data leak, a disgruntled accountant with floppy disks. This is a deeply modern parable. In an age of information, the greatest threat to a secret empire is not a spy, but a sysadmin. It warns all who would build power on secrecy that the very tools used to manage complexity can become instruments of self-destruction. The fourth lesson is about the nature of justice in the face of systemic crime. Prosecutor Lee in KYU's strategy was pedagogical. He knew that to simply arrest Kim for violence would leave the system intact. Instead, he followed the money, painstakingly mapping the entire corrupt ecosystem. The trial was thus not just about punishing a man, but about diagnosing and exposing a disease. This approach recognized that true justice, after such pervasive corruption, is not merely punitive, but restorative and educational. It must rebuild public trust by demonstrating, in meticulous, undeniable detail, how the betrayal occurred and how it is being surgically removed. The public needed to see the flowcharts, hear the testimony about monthly bribe deliveries, understand the mechanics of bid rigging. This transparency was itself a form of justice, a collective catharsis and re-education in the rule of law. Finally, Kim Tae-chon's story is a sobering lesson in legacy. He sought a legacy of power and fear, but he achieved a legacy of caution and reform. He is remembered not as a founder, but as a failure, a negative example that spurred positive change. This illustrates a fundamental law of human societies. Power that is purely extractive and destructive contains the seeds of its own irrelevance. It builds nothing lasting that the community values. His monuments were the buildings erected with rigged bids, but his real legacy is the anti-corruption laws and the civic vigilance that rose from his ashes. For democratic institutions, His story is both a warning and a testament to their resilience. The warning is that institutions are not self-cleaning. They are living organisms that require constant, vigilant maintenance by an engaged citizenry, a free press, and principled officials. The testament is that even when corruption reaches a metastatic stage, recovery is possible. It requires a perfect storm of courageous individuals, a shift in public sentiment, and institutional actors willing to risk everything to do their jobs. The democratic system in South Korea, though deeply wounded, ultimately proved resilient enough to generate its own antibodies, the Lee and Kius, the anonymous whistleblowers, the outraged voters. In the end, the story of Kim Tae-chon is not a story about a gangster. It is a story about a city, a nation, and the perpetual, unglamorous struggle to ensure that the light of accountability, however dim it may flicker at times, is never fully extinguished by the shadows of those who believe they are above the law. It confirms that the most durable power is not that which is taken by force, but that which is granted by trust, and that while the former can build empires of fear, only the latter can build societies that endure. As the final notes of this decades-long saga fade into history, the story of Kim Tae-chon consolidates from a sequence of shocking events in a singular, sobering monument, a monument not to a man, but to a multitude of truths about the human condition within complex societies. His journey from the gritty streets of post-war Busan to the sterile infirmary of a state prison traces the arc of a dark star, whose gravitational pull distorted everything in its orbit before it collapsed into a black hole of disgrace. We have traversed the landscape of his ambition, walked the corridors of his corrupted power, witnessed meticulous detective work that led to his undoing, and felt the aftershocks that reshaped a city's soul. The narrative now finds its closing synthesis not in the details of his crimes or the mechanic of his downfall, but in the enduring echoes his life leaves in our understanding of the world. Kim Tae-chon's existence proves that evil, in a modern context, is often not a dramatic, mustache-twirling villainy, but a cold, administrative function. It resides in the approving stamp on a rate contract, in the passive acceptance of a monthly envelope, in the deliberate aversion of a policeman's gaze. His empire was a testament to the banality of institutional corruption, where great harm is enacted not through passion, but through procedure poisoned by greed and fear. Conversely, his defeat proves that good is often equally procedural, equally unglamorous. A prosecutor tracing a bank transfer through a labyrinth of shell companies, an accountant risking everything to copy data onto a floppy disk, a judge upholding the dry letter of the law against immense political pressure. This is the central, enduring drama his story encapsulates, the eternal, grinding contest between the quiet corrosion of systems and the quiet courage required to repair them. His life forces us to reject simple narratives. He was not an outsider, but the ultimate insider. He was not an enemy of the state, but its malignant shadow. His power did not flourish in a failed state, but in a wildly successful one that had not yet fortified all the ethical bulwarks around its newfound wealth. This complicates our view of progress, reminding us that economic miracles can have dark underbellies, and that develop without a parallel strengthening of civic institutions creates fertile ground for predators in suits. The story also completes a profound moral and existential circle. Kim Tae-chon, who sought to control everything, the economy, the law, the political future of a region, ended his life in a cell where he controlled nothing, not even his own body's rebellion. The autonomy he stole from so many was finally stripped from him with absolute, bureaucratic finality. The fear he cultivated was, in his final years, replaced by a pervasive indifference. The legacy he coveted has been assigned to him by history as a warning, not a tribute. In this, there is a classical, almost poetic, justice. His punishment was not mere imprisonment, but the precise, mirror-image negation of his life's project. For Busan and for South Korea, his story is now a foundational stone in the national consciousness, albeit one laid in the substratum, a negative foundation upon which positive structures of transparency and accountability have been built. The city's skyline, once a testament to his corrupt influence, now stretches upward under different rules. The political class operates with the ghost of his ledger looking over its shoulder. The ordinary citizen, while perhaps still cynical, possesses a hard-earned right to That cynicism and a toolkit digital, legal and social to challenge abuses that would have been met with silent terror a generation ago. The resilience demonstrated was not innate. It was forged in the fire of scandal, a collective near-death experience that inspired a lasting will to live by a healthier code. The tale concludes, but its relevance is perpetual. In an era where distrust of institutions is rising globally, where populist strongmen often blur the lines between political leadership and criminal enterprise, and where vast wealth can still seem to obscure the reach of the law, the chronicle of the Emperor of Busan is a necessary compass. It shows us the destination of the road where money and power fuse absolutely, where the state becomes a weapon for private gain. But more importantly, it maps the difficult, unheroic, yet vital path, back a path paved with forensic accounting, protected whistleblower, a tenacious free press, and an unwavering commitment to the bland, beautiful principle that no one is above the law.